This week on ICN, the stories you should have heard, but didn't. A number of states take a constitutional shot across the bow of the federal government. Special ops helicopters in the New Orleans night. Ron Paul, the pit bull, introduces a bill to repeal the Federal Reserve. Government debt, the final bubble? Lawyers advise those confronted with foreclosure to ask banks, "Papers, please." Smoke in your home, pay a fine. One California town passes judgment. Those stories and more next on Informed Citizen News. Hello and welcome to ICN Informed Citizen News, February 8th, 2009. We start out with the story about states exercising their constitutional rights and authority. 8 states have introduced bills to assert their sovereignty under the 9th and 10th Amendments to the Constitution. There will likely be a total of 20 states that will introduce similar bills by the end of 2009. The 9th Amendment reads, "The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people." And the 10th Amendment follows, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people." The United States Constitution is a contract entered into by and among the states. It specifically identifies what the federal government can and cannot do. The 9th and 10th Amendment dictate that the federal government is finite and limited. Any issue not specifically addressed within the constitutional text is left to the states and the people. The state bills under consideration reaffirm a line that the federal government cannot cross. The common language of these bills read as a warning to the federal government that any infringement on state sovereignty will not be tolerated. New Hampshire goes even further to say that any act by the federal government that diminishes liberty of the several states and not specifically allowed by the Constitution would nullify the Constitution. New Hampshire listed these federal actions they would consider violations on state liberty. Establishing martial law or a state of emergency without state approval. Involuntary servitude or draft without declaration of war. Surrendering any power to a government or country. Any act regarding religion. Further limitations on freedom of political speech or further limitations on freedom of the press. Further infringements on the right to keep and bear arms, including prohibitions of type or quantity of arms or ammunition. The most important document for Americans to thoroughly understand is our Constitution. It's a shame that it's essentially ignored in our public schools, and because Americans' knowledge of the Constitution is very limited, we find ourselves in an economic and political mess. A bill has been introduced in the House of Representatives to set up FEMA emergency centers on military bases. The stated purpose of these FEMA centers on military bases is to provide a support base for any regional relief efforts. Some analysts are concerned and point to a vague provision contained in the bill that says, "The purpose of FEMA emergency centers on existing infrastructure is to meet other appropriate needs as determined by the Secretary of Homeland Security." Politicians put vague phrases like this in bills to allow for the greatest flexibility in interpretation. Americans continue to sleep while their liberty is under attack by an ever-growing government. We at ICN always discount anything that falls into the conspiracy theory category, but an ominous event took place in New Orleans this past week. Military special ops helicopters performed night exercises over scared and baffled witnesses at the University of New Orleans. These low-flying helicopters performed high-risk maneuvers involving detonation of explosive devices. ICN leans towards writing an event off like this as an isolated incident, but this exercise is now the second performed over a populated urban area. Less than 1 year ago, special ops helicopters, likely Delta Force units, performed takeoff and landings, rope drops, and high-risk maneuvers amongst the downtown Denver high-rises. In both of these incidents, observers were intimidated, yet transfixed on the action. You can watch both videos for yourself by searching YouTube for Denver Martial Law and New Orleans Helicopters. No matter what you believe the purpose of these military operations, these videos are amazing to watch. Ron Paul, the Capitol Hill pit bull, has just reintroduced a bill to repeal the Federal Reserve. This is not the first time he has submitted a bill to kill the Federal Reserve, as he's done this several times in his decades-long service. Each time his bill to kill the Fed has been rejected, but he is getting more attention with his increased profile in recent years. No one can accuse Ron Paul of being owned by Wall Street or driven by poll numbers. We wish we could say that about more of our representatives in government. It looks like the next, and maybe final, bubble is government debt. German newspaper Der Spiegel had an article this week entitled, "Can Countries Really Go Bankrupt?" The conclusion was that not only can they go bankrupt, but often do, and a few European countries are edging toward the brink. In something like the European Union, when one goes, many more could fall like dominoes. Countries need to borrow money for operating the government and to make interest payments. Now that countries are borrowing more because of the current crisis, the interest burden goes up. Lenders will start to doubt whether a country can keep making payments, and as a result, interest rates go even higher. This creates a debt spiral. Under the current system, countries borrow new money to pay old debts that come due. As long as there are new lenders, then the old lenders can be paid off. Sounds like a Ponzi scheme to us. Once lenders doubt they will be paid back, the whole system collapses. Just like the housing bubble, as long as there is a greater fool to pay a higher price, everything is fine. Someday, investors will stop lending. This is where the world is headed, and it won't be a pretty picture when it happens. Speaking of debt defaults, lawyers are now advising clients under threat of foreclosure to force their lender to produce the promissory note, otherwise known as the signed loan document. It turns out that only about 50% of lenders can actually prove ownership of the loan. Since most mortgages get packaged into securities and sold off to investors, a majority of lenders have to claim lost instruments in court. If the borrower challenges the lender to produce the promissory note and the lender cannot produce the document, then the foreclosure is stopped in its tracks. This is another reason why this is a big mess, and it's going to take years and a lot of pain to work our way through. We're getting toward the end of this week's show, but we find that we have a few more stories to report. Because of this, we're introducing a rapid-fire segment. Here we go. Nanny City, Belmont, California bans smoking in private homes, and violators can be fined $100. Starting this year, Oregon high school students no longer have to pass English and math competency tests to graduate high school. Oregon claims one-size-fits-all tests are not fair. Just when you thought public school standards couldn't get worse. Bloomberg News reported that 19 million homes in the U.S. were vacant at the end of 2008, and RealtyTrack, the nation's leading real estate data reporting service, told CNBC that 70% of foreclosures are not even listed for sale by banks. Banks are sitting on this foreclosure inventory because their staff is overloaded and the foreclosure process takes months. It was also noted that if the banks recognized all foreclosures on their books, most would become immediately insolvent, resulting in global economic Armageddon. Again, this is going to take a decade or more to work through this financial collapse. Finally, here's a list of prominent corporate bankruptcies in 2008. Any of these names look familiar? We're glad you could join us this week. We appreciate the comments viewers have posted, both complimentary and critical. We'll keep an eye on the powerful. You keep an eye on us. From Informed Citizen News, have a great week.